All right, welcome to my second video on occupiers liability, now with a little extra guest star, my dog Lady. So hopefully you've watched the other video where I've already been through some of the rules when it comes to occupiers. No matter what the sort of person is who's injured, you do need to go through the basics, which I went through in the last video, but just super quick reminder. There has to be an occupier, and that's the person with sufficient control over the premises. Remember, premises has a very, very broad definition that includes land, the buildings on it, and any fixed or movable structures on that as well. And the person making the claim must be injured because of the state of the premises. In other words, there was something faulty, hazardous, broken, and that's why they were injured. In the case of Keown versus Coventry NHS Trust, a boy climbed up a fire escape and fell off. Now, he was injured on the NHS hospital premises, but he wasn't injured because of the state of the premises. There was nothing wrong or hazardous, broken. There wasn't anything that needed maintenance that the occupier hadn't slacked off on. Then you need to decide if they are a lawful visitor. If they're not, they can only claim under the 84 Act, which I went through in the last video. Lawful visitors are covered by the 1957 Act. And as a quick reminder, that is your invitees, people who are asked or invited onto your premises. Licensees, people with a temporary permission to enter for a certain purpose, like a cinema goer or someone going to a football match. Or those with a statutory right to enter because the law says they're lawfully allowed on your property. So, for example, police officers, social workers, environmental officers, meter readers, people like that. Whether you want them on your land or not, they are lawfully allowed to be there, and that's even more important when people deny them permission. So when a social worker comes away to take your children away, you also have to owe them a duty of care to keep them safe while they do so. If you are a lawful visitor, then you have rights under the Occupiers Liability Act 1957. So you are entitled to sue for both personal injury, and that's up to kind of causing death, and you're entitled to claim for property damage. So if your stuff is damaged, you can claim for that as well. You then have to go into the rules in a bit more detail, especially if it's a scenario question. Let's have a look. All right. So then, what is the rule under the 1957 Act? It's very clear that for most people, Section 2, subsection 2 says that we owe them a common duty of care. Now, common doesn't kind of refer to like often or common people. It refers to common law. So the rule is essentially the same as common negligence law, which you all should be hopefully quite confident with. You owe them a common duty of care. You've got to act reasonably to keep them reasonably safe for the purposes that they're on the premises. Now, that is a lot to remember. So I always remember it by breaking it down into 3 lines. The occupier has to act reasonably. So you only have to do so much. In Fryer versus Pearson, the claimant was injured by a needle in the carpet. You don't have to go around kind of checking the carpets, the roof tiles, everything in your property before you have a visitor over. You've just got to act reasonably, like an ordinary reasonable person would. What would a reasonable occupier do? You've just got to keep the person reasonably safe. Now, that's a really important distinction. It's not about keeping the premises safe. I always picture a building site. Now, because of the nature of it, you can't keep a building site safe when a person comes onto it, but you can take reasonable steps to keep that person safe by providing things like hard hats or high-vis jackets. And lastly, you've only got to keep them safe for the purpose that they're there. So for example, if you have customers, think about the customer areas that they're going to go into. If you invite your friend over for tea, you're probably going to have to keep your lounge safe, the kitchen safe, maybe like the bathroom, but you don't have to be checking the attic and the basement. That being said, if you're inviting someone over to, I don't know, read your meters, you have to make sure the basement's safe, etc. So you've got to keep them reasonably safe for the purpose of the visit, and you've got to do that to a reasonable degree like anybody else would. If you haven't done that, a person, as we've already said, can make a claim for either personal injury, which up to including death, or damage to their property. And remember, that's more than trespassers can under the 84 Act. They have more protections because these are people with permission to be on your land. So once you've looked at that general duty, that applies to most people. There is a few special groups, as I've kind of labelled them, where there are sort of separate, different rules to be aware of. So section 2(3)A talks about children. And what the law says is that we have to be, children are less careful. What that means is the occupier has to be more careful to make up for that shortfall. So children aren't very careful, they're quite reckless, they don't consider the risks as adults do, so the adults have to do that for them. And again, just what would a reasonable occupier do? So if you own a restaurant that's family friendly, what would other restaurants that are family friendly, what would they do? Well, they would probably take into account that children aren't going to be as careful. That's particularly important when you have an allurement on your property. Now, an allurement has two parts. It is something that is attractive to children, but it also poses a danger. And you saw that in Glasgow Corporation versus Taylor, where there were berries that look like fruit, that look like cherries. That's attractive. A child would probably want to go over and investigate those, but at the same time, they were poisonous, so that's clearly a danger. Trivia fact, they were nightshade berries, the same thing that they used in Hunger Games to try and threaten suicide. There you go. That's probably the only thing you'll remember from this video now. The other thing you need to think about with children is factoring in parental supervision. My kind of hint here is to look at the type of place that the occupier is running. Is it a place where you would expect children? So if you think of a primary school, for example, it should be really quite safe for young children to be around on that premises. If you have a building site, however, you probably don't have to make it child friendly, because any children that would be there would be expected to be under parental supervision. And that's what we saw in the case of Phipps versus Rochester Corporation. We had a mining site, there were very young children involved. Where were their parents? So the law is only expecting you to do what's reasonable. Parents are expected to step in as well. And there may be elements of contributory negligence if parents have failed in their duty to keep an eye on their kids as well. However, you know, sometimes it's just nobody's fault. A really sad case of Bourne Leisure versus Marsden. A 2-year-old drowned in a pond. It wasn't really the parents' fault because they'd only looked away for a minute. It wasn't the holiday park's fault because it was usually quite safe. It was just a sad, tragic accident. So when it comes to a scenario question, what more would you have expected the occupier to do? And be careful with warning signs as well. I'm going to talk more about those again in a second, but bear in mind, if it's a sort of child hazard, if it's an allurement, a lot of children might not be able to read. So if it's a primary school, you have to bear in mind that they may not be able to read, so signs might not be a total protection. But if it's something that parents should be supervising, so for example, a fairground on rides, they really should be with parents, and parents can read the signs. At the opposite end of the scale, section 2(3)B, you have kind of tradesmen, contractors, people that you hire to come and do some work on your property. The law flips it around the other way with these. They should be careful, because remember, they're experts, they're tradesmen, they have training and experience or whatever in their field, so they should be able to take precautions for themselves. So if you hire an electrician and then they don't turn off the electricity supply before they go sticking their fingers in the sockets, that's kind of their fault. It's not really up to the occupier to say to the electrician, hey, by the way, do you need the electricity turning off? And we saw that in the case of Rolls versus Nathan. The chimney sweeps were poisoned. They had carbon monoxide poisoning after the boilers were left on when they were cleaning the chimneys, but the occupier had said to them, do you want us to turn them off? And the chimney sweep said no. So that's their risk they should know about. I mean, that being said, you know, that doesn't mean you can expose tradespeople to all risks. In the case of Salmon versus Seafarers Restaurant, which I've got to say is one of my favourite case names, it involves a fish and chip shop. And then the firefighter that was called to it was a person called Salmon. What are the chances? But they were injured in an explosion, and the Seafarers Restaurant tried to argue they weren't responsible because it's a risk of a fireman's job. But that was very much down to negligence, and they were liable. So, for example, if I invite an electrician over to come and fix my wiring and they trip on a faulty step, like, you can't turn around and say, well, you're an electrician, you should be careful. They're expected to be careful when it comes to their job. You still have to keep their premises reasonably safe for the purpose of their visit, or keep them safe while they're there. Now, if it's looking like you owe a duty of care, is there any way that the occupier can try and defend themselves? And I've put wriggle out of their responsibility. Section 2.4 does contain some information that you might want to use. So Section 2.4a, the occupier might be able to argue that they had a warning sign up. Now, warning signs must be clear and sufficient. So by that, they have to be sufficient, they have to be enough. So they have to be big, bold, brightly coloured, they have to be placed in an obvious place before you get to the hazard. No point putting a sign on the inside of the door, for example, when going through the door is dangerous. And it also has to be very clear, it has to be clearly worded. Remember, especially if it could be children. So a sign that just says warning is not a clear sufficient danger, because warning what? But if you have a sign that says danger, broken lift, then it is very, very clear what's wrong. So if that person then makes a decision to go into the lift, it's their own fault, and we call that volenti non fit injuria, or consent for short. So they consented to the risk, it's not your fault. Now, Section 2.4b, we're back to contractors. Little hint that helps me remember this, it's the B's. Section 2.3b is about tradesmen, Section 2.4b is about tradesmen. Now, this is where you argue that it's not your fault as the occupier that a person got hurt. A person got hurt because you hired a tradesman to do a job, but they didn't do it properly. So, for example, if you had a broken lift and you hired a person to come and fix it, a lift technician, if a person's injured using the lift, that's probably not going to be the occupier's fault anymore, because they hired someone to fix it. Clearly the fault lies with the person who didn't fix it right. So how do we shift the blame here? And that's kind of what I call it, shifting the blame. First off, it had to be specialist work that you kind of couldn't really check or do anything about. So in Woodward versus the Mayor of Hastings, a claimant slipped on icy steps at a school. They sued the school. The Mayor of Hastings was in charge of the school, and they tried to say, well, it's not our fault because we hired people to clear the steps. Thing is, that's not specialist work. That's something that the occupier can easily do themselves. So in other words, they could check it. It doesn't take a specialist to look at some icy steps and go, they're still icy, you haven't cleaned them well enough, so they were still responsible. You also have to make sure that the people you're hiring are reasonable, trustworthy, and reputable. They are able to do the job. In other words, if you try and cut corners, if you hire people who are kind of cowboy builders, that's still your fault. But if you made sure, as far as you were aware, someone was reputable, then you should be entitled to expect them to do a good job. In the case of Gwilliam, the NHS Trust, a hospital, was holding a fundraising event, and they hired a company to build a splat wall. And essentially it's a Velcro wall. You put on a Velcro suit and then you kind of jump onto the wall and stick to it. And a woman was injured when the wall collapsed. Now she tried to sue the NHS Trust after the fundraising event. She tried to sue them, saying that, you know, she was injured on their premises. The hospital tried to say, well, it wasn't our fault. We hired someone reputable, and they had. So therefore it wasn't their fault. they'd shifted the blame onto the contractors. And that's really key, actually. If it's a scenario question, don't just point out that the occupier is not to blame. Point out that they may be able to sue the contractor instead in negligence. So she was able to sue the splat wall operators, but they'd already shut down. She would have been able to in theory. And lastly, if it was possible, only if it was possible, you should have checked the work. So as I said, in the case of Woodward, they were able to look at the steps and go, nah, that's not good enough, they're still icy, do it again. But if you have, going back to say the lift technician, if you checked it to the extent you can, I don't know, maybe you've pressed the button, the lift appears, hey presto, it's fine. If a fault develops later, I mean, how could you have checked that anymore? What else could you have done? You're not a lift technician. If they'd opened up the panel and showed you the wiring, you wouldn't be able to go, yes, good job, you've done it right. That being said, of course, if it was on fire, you know, that's kind of an obvious thing. The law, again, is quite reasonable and common sense. If you had someone do a job and you found someone decent to do the job, you checked it the best you could, but you're not a specialist, then you've kind of done your bit. What more do we expect that person to do? You're not expected to hire another lift technician to check the first lift technician's work, and then you need to check a third one, hire a third one to check the second's checking of the first one. That would just be ridiculous. If you've hired someone reputable, you're entitled to trust them to do the job properly. And if you've sort of looked at it and it looks like it's been done properly, if something goes wrong, it must be the contractor's fault. So it's not the occupier. The claimant then would have to sue someone else. So occupier's liability, I think, is a really interesting topic. You've just got to be really, really careful to identify first. Are they a lawful visitor or are they non-lawful? There is some kind of overlaps generally that you've got to act reasonably, but there are some key differences. So make sure you go through them. I hope you found that useful. I think I've managed to put Lady to sleep. I hope you're still awake. Thank you very much for listening. Come on then.